April 23, 1945. The Third Reich had less than 3 weeks left to exist, though the children kneeling in the mud of a makeshift prisoner compound near Heidelberg didn't know this yet. What they did know, with the absolute certainty that only propaganda and terror can create, was that they were about to die. 14-year-old Konrad Lehmann kept his eyes fixed on the ground, counting the drops of rain that fell into the puddle forming between his worn boots. If he focused on something small and ordinary, maybe the fear wouldn't completely consume him before the Americans decided how to kill them. Next to him, 12-year-old Reinhold Graf was crying silently, his thin shoulders shaking beneath the oversized Wehrmacht jacket that hung on his small frame like a costume. On Konrad's other side, 16-year-old Gerhard Neumann sat with the rigid posture of someone determined to die with dignity, even though his hands trembled visibly. Manfred Lang, 13, stared straight ahead with empty eyes, while 15-year-old Theodor Braun whispered prayers under his breath that none of them really believed anymore. They were Hitler Youth. Volkssturm, the final desperate measure of a dying regime that had run out of men and turned to its children instead. Just 6 weeks earlier, they had been handed rifles that were nearly as tall as they were and told they were Germany's last hope against the Allied invaders. Their training had lasted 3 days. Konrad had fired his rifle exactly twice before being sent to defend a bridge that American tanks rolled over as if it were made of paper. They had been soldiers for less than 2 months. Before that, Konrad had been worried about his mathematics exam. Reinhold had collected stamps. Gerhard had dreamed of becoming an architect. Manfred had helped his father in their bookshop. Theodor had sung in the church choir every Sunday. Now they were prisoners of war, waiting for the execution that their Hitler youth leaders had promised would come the moment they were captured. "The American soldiers will torture you first," their commander had told them during their brief training. "They will make you suffer for defending the fatherland. Better to die fighting than to fall into their hands." But Konrad hadn't died fighting. None of them had. When the American infantry had surrounded their position, Gerhard had been the first to raise his hands in surrender. The rest had followed, dropping weapons they barely knew how to use, too exhausted and terrified to do anything else. The Americans had searched them roughly, removing hidden knives and one grenade that Theodor had been clutching so tightly his palm bore the imprint of its ridges. Then they had been herded into transport trucks with dozens of other prisoners, adults who looked at them with a mixture of pity and shame. Now they knelt in the rain, waiting. Around them, American soldiers stood guard, their rifles ready, but pointed at the ground rather than at the prisoners. Some of them looked impossibly young themselves, perhaps only a few years older than Gerhard. Others were clearly veterans, their faces weathered and weary. None of them looked like the savage monsters the boys had been taught to expect. The rain had stopped by the time an American officer approached their group. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair beginning to gray at the temples. A sergeant's stripes marked his sleeve, and his boots were caked with the same mud that covered everything in this miserable spring of 1945. Konrad forced himself to look up, expecting to see hatred or cruelty in the man's face. Instead, he saw something that confused him more than any anger could have. The sergeant looked tired, not just physically exhausted, though the lines around his eyes suggested many sleepless nights, but tired in a way that went deeper. He looked at the 5 boys kneeling in the mud, and something in his expression shifted. It wasn't quite pity, but it wasn't hardness either. The sergeant spoke to another American soldier, gesturing toward the boys. Konrad couldn't understand the words, but he recognized the tone of someone giving orders. 2 younger soldiers approached, and Konrad braced himself. This was it. This was when the torture would begin, just as they had been warned. But the soldiers simply pulled them to their feet one by one, checking that their hands remained visible and their movements slow. Reinhold stumbled, his legs cramped from kneeling for so long, and one of the American soldiers caught his arm to steady him. The boy flinched violently at the touch, expecting a blow. None came. They were led toward a large tent, that had been erected at the edge of the compound. Inside, the ground was covered with wooden pallets to keep them out of the mud, and canvas walls blocked the wind that had been cutting through their thin uniforms. Other German prisoners sat on the ground or on wooden crates, most of them adult soldiers who watched the boys enter with expressions ranging from sympathy to disgust. One older prisoner, a Wehrmacht corporal with a bandaged arm, spat on the ground as they passed. "Kindersoldaten," he muttered. "Children playing at war. The shame of Germany." Conrad felt his face burn, but he kept his eyes forward. They had heard similar comments from adult prisoners during the truck ride. The regular soldiers blamed them for nothing and everything, for being too young to fight, for fighting anyway, for surrendering, for the war itself. As if 5 boys could have changed the outcome of anything. The Americans directed them to a corner of the tent where they could sit together. Blankets were tossed to each of them, rough wool that smelled of storage and dampness but was warmer than anything they had felt in weeks. Theodore wrapped his around his shoulders immediately, his teeth chattering from cold and fear. Manfred folded his neatly beside him, as if accepting comfort from the enemy was a betrayal. Gerhard watched the Americans with calculating eyes, trying to understand what was happening. This wasn't what they had been told to expect. Hours passed in the tent, each minute stretching into an eternity of waiting. The 5 boys sat huddled together, speaking in whispers when they spoke at all. Around them, the sounds of the prisoner compound created a constant backdrop of noise. Guards calling to each other in English, trucks rumbling past, the occasional shout or clatter of equipment, but no one came to question them. No one came to hurt them. The uncertainty was almost worse than if the execution had come immediately. Conrad's mind kept creating terrible scenarios of what the Americans might be planning. Perhaps they were waiting until dark. Perhaps they were deciding which methods to use. Perhaps they were making them wait deliberately to increase their fear. His Hitler Youth training had been filled with stories of American atrocities, of prisoners tortured for information they didn't have, of slow deaths designed to break German spirits. But as the afternoon wore on, something strange began to happen. American soldiers would occasionally pass through the tent, checking on prisoners, distributing water in metal canteens. When they reached the boys, they showed no particular interest beyond ensuring everyone had water. One young private, barely old enough to shave, stopped and stared at Reinhold for a long moment. The 12-year-old shrank back, certain this was the moment violence would begin. Instead, the American soldier shook his head slowly and walked away, muttering something under his breath that sounded sad rather than angry. Theodore was the first to voice what they were all thinking. "Why are they waiting?" he whispered in German, his eyes darting toward the tent entrance. "What are they waiting for? Maybe they are deciding what to do with us," Gerhard replied, his voice steady despite the fear. Conrad could see in his eyes. "We are not regular soldiers. Maybe there are special rules for prisoners our age." "There are no special rules," Manfred said flatly. "We fought against them. We are enemies. Age does not matter in war." "But we barely fought," Reinhold protested, his voice breaking. "I fired my rifle once, and I missed. I missed everything. I could not even see what I was shooting at." Conrad said nothing. He had fired his rifle more than once during the defense of the bridge. He remembered the kick against his shoulder, the deafening noise, the smell of gunpowder. He remembered seeing American soldiers taking cover, remembered hearing someone scream. He didn't know if he had hit anyone. He didn't want to know. As darkness began to fall, electric lights strung throughout the tent flickered to life, casting harsh shadows. The boys drew closer together instinctively, 5 children trying to find safety in proximity. "Tomorrow," Gerhard said quietly. "Tomorrow, they will decide what to do with us." The next morning arrived with unexpected sounds, not gunfire or the tramp of boots coming to drag them away, but the mundane clatter of metal pans and the smell of food cooking. Real food, not the watery soup or stale bread they had been surviving on for weeks. Conrad's stomach growled traitorously, reminding him that fear didn't erase hunger. The 5 boys had barely slept. taking turns staying awake to watch for danger that never came. Now, in the gray light of dawn, they watched as American soldiers set up what appeared to be a field kitchen just outside the tent. Steam rose from large pots, and the smell of cooking meat drifted through the canvas walls, making Conrad's mouth water, despite his terror. When the sergeant from the previous day appeared at the tent entrance, all 5 boys tensed. This was it. Whatever the Americans had planned, it would happen now. But the sergeant simply gestured for all the prisoners to form a line. Adult German soldiers rose and shuffled toward the tent opening, and after a moment's hesitation, Gerhard stood and pulled Reinhold to his feet. The others followed. Outside, the morning was cold but clear, the mud from yesterday's rain beginning to dry in patches. A serving line had been set up with American soldiers standing behind tables laden with food. As each prisoner reached the front, they were handed a metal tray and served portions of scrambled eggs, beans, and something Conrad had never seen before, long cylindrical pieces of meat and soft bread rolls. When Conrad reached the front of the line, a young American soldier placed one of the strange sandwiches on his tray. "Hot dog," the soldier said, pointing at the food. "Good. Eat." The words were simple, clearly meant for someone who didn't speak English. Conrad stared at the food, unable to process what was happening. They were being fed. Not starved, not poisoned, but fed. The portion was larger than anything he had eaten in months. Reinhold, receiving his tray, looked up at the American serving him with such confusion that the soldier smiled despite himself. "It's okay, kid," he said gently, even though Reinhold couldn't understand the words. "Just food. Go on." The 5 boys carried their trays to a spot away from the adult prisoners and sat on the ground. For a long moment, none of them moved. Theodore was the first to speak. "What if it's poisoned?" he whispered. "What if this is how they kill us?" "You think they would poison hundreds of prisoners just to kill 5 boys?" Gerhard replied, his logic cutting through the fear. "If they wanted us dead, there are easier ways." He picked up the hot dog and took a careful bite. His eyes widened. "It's real," he said quietly. "It's actually food." Conrad watched as Gerhard took another bite, then slowly picked up his own hot dog. The bread was soft and fresh, nothing like the moldy rations they had received in their brief time as soldiers. The meat inside was warm and seasoned with flavors he couldn't identify, but that made his empty stomach ache with need. Conrad bit into the hot dog, and for a moment the war disappeared. The taste was unlike anything in his recent memory. Salty, savory, rich with fat and spices that made his depleted body sing with desperate need. He had forgotten that food could taste like this, could be something more than fuel to keep a body moving. For the past months, eating had been about survival, choking down whatever was available while your stomach cramped with hunger. This was different. This was abundance. This was care. He looked down at his tray and saw that the scrambled eggs were real eggs, not the powdered substitute he had grown accustomed to. The beans had bits of pork mixed in, and there was even a small square of butter melting on the side of the tray. It was more food than he had seen in one place since before the war had turned desperate. Beside him, Reinhold was crying again, but this time the tears fell onto his food as he ate with desperate intensity, as if afraid someone would take it away. Manfred ate slowly, methodically, his face carefully blank, but his hands shaking as he held the hot dog. Theodore paused between bites to whisper another prayer, this one sounding more like gratitude than fear. Even Gerhard, who had maintained his composure through their capture and imprisonment, ate with an intensity that revealed just how hungry they had all been. Around them, other German prisoners were having similar reactions. Some ate in silence, others spoke in low voices, expressing confusion about why their captors were feeding them so well. The American soldiers moved through the area, offering seconds to anyone who wanted more. Seconds. Conrad could barely comprehend it. When a young American private approached their group with a pot of coffee, Conrad flinched instinctively. But the soldier just filled the metal cup attached to each of their trays, his movements casual and unthreatening. He paused when he reached. Reinhold seemed to notice how young the boy was and returned a moment later with a canteen of water instead, apparently deciding coffee was too harsh for a 12-year-old. The gesture was so unexpectedly thoughtful that Conrad felt something crack inside his chest. This was the enemy. These were the soldiers they had been taught to hate and fear, the invaders who supposedly wanted to destroy Germany and murder its people. Yet they were being fed better as prisoners than they had been fed as soldiers of the Reich. The contradiction was too large to fit inside Conrad's understanding of the world. He thought about his Hitler youth leader, Hauptsturmführer Koch, who had given them their rifles and their 3 days of training. "The Americans will show you no mercy," Koch had said, his voice hard with certainty. "They will treat you worse than animals because you dared to defend German soil. Better to die with honor than to suffer their cruelty." But where was the cruelty? Where was the torture? After breakfast, the 5 boys were directed to a different section of the camp, separate from the adult prisoners. 2 American soldiers escorted them to a smaller tent that had been set up near the perimeter fence. Inside, they found wooden bunks with actual mattresses, thin but present, and several other young German prisoners, none older than 17. The Americans left them there with a warning delivered in broken German by one soldier who had apparently learned some of the language. "No trouble. Stay here. Safe." The word safe hung in the air after the soldiers departed. Conrad looked around the tent at the other young faces, all wearing the same expression of confusion and cautious relief. There were perhaps 15 boys total in this section, all of them captured in the final desperate weeks of the war, when Germany had been scraping the bottom of its barrel of potential soldiers. One boy, maybe 15, with red hair and freckles, approached them cautiously. "I am Victor," he said in German. "From Munich. You are new?" Gerhard nodded and introduced their group. Victor's face showed recognition when he heard where they had been captured. "We heard about that bridge," he said quietly. "We heard the Hitler youth units there fought hard." "We didn't fight hard," Reinhold said, his voice small. "We surrendered." Victor's expression softened. "Smart," he said. "I surrendered too. We all did. That's why we're alive." He gestured around the tent at the other boys. "Most of us have been here for a week, some longer. The Americans keep us separate from the adult soldiers. I think they don't know what to do with us." Over the next hours, the boys began to talk among themselves, sharing stories of capture, of the final chaotic days of combat, of the propaganda they had believed, and the reality they had discovered. One boy, Hans, had been part of an anti-aircraft unit in Berlin, firing at American bombers with equipment that barely worked. Another, Friedrich, had been given a Panzerfaust and told to stop a tank column with 3 other teenagers. None of them had succeeded in their missions. All of them had survived by surrendering, and all of them were grappling with the same disorienting realization that their captors were not the monsters they had been promised. In the afternoon, something unexpected happened. An American soldier, younger than most they had seen, appeared at the tent entrance carrying a wooden crate. He set it down and opened it, revealing its contents with a gesture that needed no translation. Inside were balls, soccer balls, footballs, even a worn baseball and glove. The soldier pointed to an open area beyond the tent, then mimicked kicking a ball. His meaning was clear. They were being given permission to play. For a long moment, none of the boys moved. Playing seemed impossible, frivolous, wrong somehow when just yesterday they had been soldiers waiting to die. But Victor walked forward and picked up one of the soccer balls. He looked back at the others with something almost like a smile. Sergeant William Carter stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the German boys kick the soccer ball back and forth with increasing enthusiasm. They were still tentative, still glancing toward the guards as if expecting permission to be revoked at any moment. But gradually they were remembering how to move like children instead of soldiers. He had been the one to suggest separating the young prisoners from the adults, and he had been the one to scrounge up the sports equipment from supplies donated by the Red Cross. His commanding officer had looked at him skeptically, but approved the request. "They're just kids," Carter had argued. "Whatever they did, they're still just kids." Now, watching them play, he felt the familiar ache in his chest that had been his constant companion since leaving home 8 months ago. His son, David, was 13, almost exactly the same age as the dark-haired boy who had just kicked the ball, the quiet one who rarely smiled. Carter had last seen David standing on the front porch of their house in Ohio, trying hard not to cry as his father prepared to deploy. They had played catch that morning, one final game of baseball before Carter left. He wondered if David still practiced his pitching like he had promised. He wondered if his son had grown taller in the months since he had been gone. Looking at these German boys, Carter saw his son in every face. He saw David in the youngest one, the 12-year-old with the scared eyes who flinched at sudden movements. He saw him in the tall one, trying to maintain dignity and control. He saw him in all of them, and the sight made him physically ill with a combination of grief and rage. Not rage at the boys themselves, but rage at the men who had put rifles in their hands and sent them to die for a cause that was already lost. "What kind of country sacrifices its children?" he had asked Captain Morrison the night before. "What kind of leadership looks at 12-year-olds and sees soldiers?" Morrison had no answer, just shook his head and poured them both another drink from the bottle they weren't supposed to have. Carter thought about the Hitler youth training camps they had discovered as they pushed deeper into Germany. He had seen the propaganda posters showing young boys in uniform, faces set with determination, defending the fatherland. He had read the captured training manuals that taught children to see dying for Germany as the highest honor, and he had seen the results in the final weeks of combat. Kids who could barely hold rifles being thrown into defensive positions against battle-hardened American infantry. Some of those kids had fired at his men. Some of his men had been forced to fire back. These 5 boys had been luckier. They had survived. They had surrendered before being forced into a battle that would have killed them. Now they were Carter's responsibility, and he was determined that whatever else happened, they would be treated with the dignity that children deserved. The next morning, Private Daniel Foster approached the young prisoner's tent, carrying a worn canvas bag that contained one of his most prized possessions, his baseball card collection. It was a strange thing to carry through a war zone, and his buddies had given him endless grief about the space it took up in his pack. But Foster had always believed that small pieces of home were what kept soldiers sane. Now, watching these German kids trying to understand their new reality, he thought maybe his cards could serve a different purpose. He had been the one kicking the soccer ball with them yesterday afternoon, using gestures and demonstrations to teach them basic English words: ball, kick, goal, run. The kids had picked it up quickly, especially the 14-year-old who seemed to be the group's unofficial leader. Foster sat down on a crate near where the 5 boys from yesterday were sitting together, still somewhat separate from the other young prisoners. He pulled out his baseball cards and spread a few on the wooden surface beside him. Immediately, several boys leaned in with curiosity. Foster pointed to a card showing Joe DiMaggio mid-swing. "Baseball," he said clearly, "American sport." He mimed swinging a bat, then pointed to the ball and glove they had been given yesterday. The boys watched intently, and Foster saw the moment comprehension dawned on the oldest one's face. "Like cricket?" the boy asked in heavily accented English, surprising Foster with his knowledge. "Sort of," Foster replied, then launched into an explanation using simple English, hand gestures, and demonstrations with the actual baseball. Over the next hour, more boys gathered around as Foster taught them not just about baseball, but used the cards as a way to teach English vocabulary: player, bat, uniform, team, stadium. He would point to elements in the photographs and name them, and the boys would repeat the words, their pronunciation improving with each attempt. The dark-haired leader, Conrad, he had learned from the others, proved especially adept. He would repeat each word several times under his breath, committing it to memory, then use it in a hesitant sentence. "This is player?" he asked, pointing to a card. "Yes," Foster confirmed. "This player is Ted Williams. He plays for the Boston Red Sox." "Boston," Conrad repeated, testing the word. "Red Sox. What is Sox?" Foster smiled and pulled off his boot, pointing to his sock. "Socks. More than one sock." Conrad's eyes lit up with understanding, and he turned to explain to the youngest boy, Reinhold, in rapid German. Foster let them use their own language when they needed to clarify concepts. The goal wasn't to stop them from being German, just to help them communicate. As the lesson continued, Foster noticed Sergeant Carter watching from a distance, a complex expression on his face. The sergeant had been the driving force behind treating these kids differently from regular prisoners, and Foster respected him for it. Later, Carter approached and looked at the baseball cards spread out among the German boys. "Teaching them English or teaching them to be American?" Carter asked, though his tone wasn't critical. "Maybe both," Foster admitted. The screaming woke everyone in the tent just after midnight. Conrad jerked awake in his bunk, his heart pounding, momentarily confused about where he was. The sound came again, a howl of pure terror that dissolved into desperate German words. "No, please, I didn't mean to. I'm sorry, Mama. Help me. Mama, please." It was Reinhold. The 12-year-old was thrashing in his bunk, tangled in his blanket, his face contorted with nightmare anguish. Gerhard reached him first, shaking him gently but firmly. "Reinhold, wake up. You're dreaming. Wake up now." Other boys in the tent were sitting up, some looking frightened, others resigned. This wasn't the first time someone had woken screaming from nightmares. It happened nearly every night to someone different. 2 American guards appeared at the tent entrance, drawn by the noise, their hands on their weapons but not drawing them. When they saw it was just a nightmare, they relaxed slightly. One of them, Foster, the private who had been teaching them baseball, approached at Reinhold's bunk. The boy had woken, but was still gasping, tears streaming down his face. Foster spoke in his careful, simple English. "You okay? Bad dream?" Conrad translated quietly, and Reinhold nodded, unable to speak. Foster left and returned a few minutes later with a canteen of water and 2 aspirin tablets. "For head," he said, pointing to his own temple, "help sleep better." Reinhold took them with shaking hands, whispering "Danke" so quietly it was barely audible. After the guards left and the other boys settled back into their bunks, the 5 of them sat together in the darkness. None of them could sleep now. "Do you remember what you did?" Manfred asked. Suddenly, his voice flat. "During the fighting, do you remember?" "I remember everything," Gerhard said quietly. "Every moment, every shot I fired. I see it when I close my eyes." Conrad felt his throat tighten. He remembered too. The chaos of combat, the deafening noise, the smoke and confusion. He remembered firing his rifle at shapes moving through the trees, never knowing if his bullets found targets or not. He remembered the body they had found in the rubble near the bridge, an American soldier not much older than Gerhard. He remembered thinking the dead man looked like he could have been someone's older brother. "I killed people," Theodore said, and his voice broke on the words. "I know I did. I saw them fall. I saw what the grenades did. They made us throw grenades at the tanks, and there were soldiers near the tanks, and I saw what happened to them." The others were silent. What words could possibly address that? They were children who had been made into killers, who had taken lives, before they truly understood what life meant. "I dream about my mother," Reinhold whispered. "But in the dreams, she looks at me the way that American soldier looked at me yesterday. Like she doesn't recognize me, like I'm something terrible that she can't understand. In the dream, I try to tell her I'm sorry, but she just keeps walking away." Conrad wanted to offer comfort, but couldn't find the words. How could he comfort Reinhold about something he felt himself? The guilt was suffocating, made worse by the kindness of their captors. The Americans fed them, gave them blankets, taught them baseball and English. Every 3 days, an American soldier would arrive at the young prisoners section, with a canvas bag containing mail. The adult German prisoners received occasional letters from home, processed through the International Red Cross, and carefully censored by American intelligence. Each time the mail call happened, the boys in the young prisoners' tent would watch with desperate hope, waiting to hear their names called. For most of them, including Conrad and his group, no names were ever called. By late May, they had been prisoners for nearly a month, and the silence from home was becoming its own form of torture. Conrad had written 3 letters to his mother and younger sister in Dresden, carefully composed messages letting them know he was alive and safe. He had no idea if the letters had been sent, if they had arrived, or if anyone was there to receive them. Dresden had been bombed in February, just 2 months before his capture. The reports they had heard, even through official German channels, had been catastrophic. Tens of thousands dead, the city reduced to ruins. But reports were vague, and Conrad had no way of knowing if his family's neighborhood had been in the affected areas. Reinhold's situation was even worse. His family had been in Berlin, right in the path of the Soviet advance. The last news he had received, back in March, before he was sent to the front, was that his parents and 3 siblings were trying to evacuate westward. After that, nothing. No letters, no word through the Red Cross, no information at all. The boy's hope was dying a little more each day, visible in the way his shoulders slumped whenever mail call ended without his name. Theodore had received 1 letter, which arrived in the 3rd week of May. His grandmother, the only family he had left after his parents died in a bombing raid the previous year, had written from Bavaria. The letter was brief, just confirming she was alive and safe in a small village that had been occupied by American forces without significant fighting. But even that small piece of good news was bittersweet. She wrote that she was being cared for by neighbors, that the Americans had been mostly kind, and that she prayed for his safe return. She did not mention what she thought of her grandson having been a soldier. She did not acknowledge the shame or the horror. She simply said she loved him and wanted him home. Manfred's letter arrived the same day as Theodore's, but its contents were far different. His father, a postal clerk in Hamburg, wrote in careful, controlled sentences that radiated cold disappointment. "You have disgraced our family name," the letter said. "To be captured by the enemy is to show cowardice. You should have fought with honor until death rather than surrender. Your mother weeps daily for the son she thought she knew." Manfred read the letter once, his face completely blank, then folded it carefully and placed it in his pocket. He said nothing about its contents, but Conrad saw how his hands shook and how he didn't eat dinner that evening. Gerhard wrote letters too, but with less hope than the others. His family had been in Cologne, which had been under Allied occupation since March. Early June brought something that would change everything for the young prisoners. Sergeant Carter assembled all the boys in their section and told them through a translator that they needed to see something important. His face was grave, his usual gentle demeanor replaced by something harder and more resolved. The boys were led to a tent where photographs had been pinned to boards, dozens of them, all in black and white. Conrad didn't understand at first what he was looking at. The images showed people, or what remained of people, so thin they looked like skeletons with skin stretched over bone, mountains of bodies, open pits filled with corpses, buildings that looked like prison barracks, fences topped with wire. Carter spoke through the translator, his voice steady but strained. "These are concentration camps, places your government built, places where millions of people were murdered, Jews, political prisoners, anyone the Nazis deemed undesirable. These photographs were taken by our soldiers as we liberated these camps." Conrad felt his stomach turn. He moved closer to one photograph, needing to see it clearly, needing to confirm that what he was seeing was real. The image showed a pile of bodies, men and women and children stacked like firewood. Their faces were visible, frozen in death, their eyes still open. Another photograph showed survivors, living skeletons staring at the camera with expressions that held no hope, no humanity left in them. Just emptiness. "This is Buchenwald," Carter continued, pointing to a series of photographs. "This is Dachau. This is Bergen-Belsen. These camps were in Germany, your Germany. Some of you may have lived near them." Around Conrad, the other boys were having similar reactions. Some were crying, others stood frozen in shock. Victor, the red-haired boy from Munich, was vomiting in the corner. Reinhold had covered his eyes and was shaking his head repeatedly, as if refusing to believe what he had seen. "But we didn't know," Gerhard said, his voice breaking. "We were told the camps were for criminals, for enemies of the state. We didn't know this was happening." Carter's expression was unreadable. Many Germans are saying they didn't know, but these camps existed for years. Trains carried people to them. Smoke from the crematoriums filled the sky. Your government did this while telling you to fight for the fatherland. Conrad thought about his Hitler Youth training, about the speeches about German superiority and the need to protect the homeland from its enemies. He thought about the pride he had felt wearing his uniform, believing he was serving something noble and worth defending. Everything had been a lie. Not just some things, everything. The country he thought he knew had never existed. Theodore was praying again, but this time his prayers sounded like apologies. The photographs haunted them. In the days following Carter's presentation, the boys moved through the camp like ghosts, their faces reflecting an internal struggle that none of them knew how to articulate. Everything they had been taught, everything they had believed about their country and their cause, had been revealed as a foundation built on atrocities so monstrous that their minds could barely comprehend them. Conrad found himself unable to sleep without seeing those images behind his eyelids. The skeletal faces, the piles of bodies, the empty eyes of survivors who looked like they had already died inside. He had been 14 years old when he joined the Hitler Youth, proud to serve, believing the propaganda about German greatness and the threats facing the fatherland. Now he was still 14, but he felt centuries older. The other boys were struggling similarly. Manfred, who had maintained a stoic distance from the Americans, now seemed hollow, as if something essential had been carved out of him. Gerhard, always the leader, sat for hours staring at nothing, his usual confidence shattered. Theodore's prayers had become constant, a desperate attempt to find some moral framework that could accommodate what they had learned. And Reinhold, the youngest, seemed to have aged years in a single day. Private Foster tried to maintain their English lessons, but the enthusiasm had drained from the sessions. The boys still participated, but mechanically, without the spark of curiosity that had been building. Foster didn't push. He understood that something fundamental had broken inside these kids, and he gave them space to process it. One afternoon, Conrad approached Sergeant Carter, his English now sufficient for basic conversation. "The photographs," he began hesitantly. "My family in Dresden. Did they know? Were they part of this?" Carter's expression softened slightly. "Most ordinary Germans probably didn't know the full extent," he said carefully, "but many knew something was wrong. Many chose not to look too closely. The question is, what you do with the knowledge you have now?" Conrad nodded slowly, though Carter's answer provided no comfort. If his mother had known, even partially, what did that mean? If she hadn't known, how could she not have known? And what did it say about him that he had served the regime that committed these horrors, even as a child who didn't understand what he was serving? Victor, the boy from Munich, had written a letter to his parents that he showed to Conrad before sending it. In careful handwriting, he had written, "I cannot come home the same person who left. I have seen what our country did. I have seen the truth behind the lies we were told. I don't know if I can ever be German again in the way I was before." Conrad understood exactly what he meant. Their German identity, the pride they had taken in their heritage and culture, was now inseparably linked to genocide. In mid-June, Captain Morrison called a meeting of all the young prisoners. He stood before them with a translator and several official-looking documents, his expression grave but not unkind. The war in Europe was officially over. Germany had surrendered. Now decisions needed to be made about repatriation. The word hung in the air like a threat and a promise simultaneously. Repatriation meant going home. But what was home now? Morrison explained that the International Red Cross was organizing the return of prisoners of war to Germany. Transport ships were being arranged. Processing centers were being established in the occupied zones. Within months, possibly weeks, they would have the opportunity to return. However, Morrison continued, his voice careful, "We understand that some of you may have special circumstances. Families lost or displaced. Homes destroyed. Some of you may need more time before you're ready to return. We can discuss individual situations." Conrad looked around at the other boys. Their faces reflected the same confused mixture of emotions he felt. Part of him desperately wanted to go home, to find his mother and sister, to sleep in his own bed and pretend none of this had ever happened. But another part of him feared what he would find in Germany. Not just the physical destruction, though that was terrifying. Enough, but the moral devastation. How could he return to a country that had committed such horrors? How could he face his family and neighbors knowing what their government had done in their name? And how could he explain that he had been treated better as a prisoner by the enemy than he had been treated as a soldier by his own country? That night, the 5 boys who had been together since their capture sat in a circle, speaking in quiet German. "We should go home," Gerhard said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Our families need to know we're alive." "If they're alive," Reinhold whispered, "we don't know if anyone is waiting for us." Manfred's face was hard. "My father made it clear in his letter what he thinks of me. I am a disgrace, a coward. Why would I return to that?" "Because it's home," Theodore argued. "Because despite everything, it's still where we belong." But Conrad wasn't sure belonging was that simple anymore. The Germany he had belonged to had never really existed. It had been a carefully constructed lie, and beneath that lie was something monstrous. The Americans had shown them more kindness in 6 weeks of captivity than the Reich had shown them in their entire young lives. They had been fed, given blankets, taught English, treated like human beings instead of expendable resources. Sergeant Carter looked at them like they were children who deserved protection. Private Foster taught them baseball with genuine enthusiasm. These were supposed to be the enemy, yet they acted more like protectors than anyone in the Hitler Youth leadership ever had. The deadline for declaring repatriation intentions was July 1st. As the date approached, the young prisoners began to divide into 2 distinct groups: those who had decided to return to Germany immediately, and those who were still uncertain. Victor was among the first to announce his decision to go home. He gathered several boys around him one evening and explained his reasoning with a conviction that came from deep reflection. "My parents are in Munich," he said. "I received a letter last week. They survived. Our house still stands. They want me home. How can I refuse them that?" "But more than that," he continued, his voice growing stronger, "Germany needs us. Not the Germany that was, but the Germany that must be built. We have seen the truth now. We know what was done in our name. If everyone who knows the truth stays away, who will rebuild our country into something better?" His words resonated with several boys. Hans, the former anti-aircraft gunner from Berlin, nodded in agreement. "We cannot run from what our country did. We must face it, acknowledge it, and work to make sure it never happens again." Friedrich, who had been given a Panzerfaust at 15 and told to stop tanks, added his voice. "The Americans showed us mercy when we didn't deserve it. Maybe we can take that lesson home. Maybe we can show our countrymen that their enemies were more humane than their own leaders." Over the following days, more boys joined this group. They wrote letters to their families declaring their intention to return. They made plans, spoke about what they would do when they got home, how they would help rebuild. Their conversations took on a tone of hope mixed with determination. They would return not as defeated soldiers, but as young men who had learned difficult truths and chose to face them. Gerhard surprised Conrad by announcing he would return as well. "I have been thinking about what Father Mueller said to those women prisoners we heard about," he explained to his 4 companions, "about duty and responsibility. We have a duty to bear witness to what we've learned. Someone needs to tell the truth in Germany about what the Americans are really like, about how they treated us." Theodore nodded slowly. "My grandmother is alone. She needs me. I cannot abandon her to face the occupation by herself." But his voice carried guilt, as if he felt he was abandoning something else by leaving. Manfred remained silent during these conversations. His father's letter had cut deep, and the wound hadn't healed. Conrad could see the internal battle playing out behind his friend's eyes. The pull of home versus the fear of rejection, the desire to belong versus the knowledge that belonging might mean accepting unacceptable things. Reinhold, the youngest, clung to Conrad with increasing desperation as more boys declared their intentions to return. "What should we do?" he asked repeatedly. "Where do we belong?" Conrad had no answer. He was wrestling with the same questions, feeling torn between 2 impossible choices. As July approached, it became clear that not all the boys would choose repatriation. A smaller group began to form, those who spoke in hushed voices about staying, about finding a way to remain in American custody or somehow immigrate to the United States. Their reasons were varied but equally compelling. Conrad found himself drawn to this group, though he hadn't yet made final decision. One boy, Ernst, had received devastating news through the Red Cross. His entire family had perished in the Soviet advance on Berlin. Parents, 2 sisters, his grandmother, all dead. He had no home to return to, no family waiting. "What would I go back for?" he asked the group. "To live in rubble among strangers? To be reminded every day of what I've lost? At least here, I can start over. Maybe become something other than a German orphan." Another boy, Klaus, had different reasons. "My father was SS," he said quietly, shame coloring his voice. "He's dead now, killed at the end of the war. But his name, his reputation, that follows me. If I return to our town, everyone will know me as the son of an SS officer. They'll either hate me or expect me to be proud of what he did. I can't live with either. Here, I can just be Klaus. Just a boy trying to figure out how to be a decent person." Conrad understood that sentiment deeply. The weight of German identity had become crushing. Every time he said where he was from, every time he spoke German, he felt the shadow of the concentration camps falling over him. How could he be proud of being German when being German now meant being associated with genocide? Private Foster had told him about something called immigration, about how people could apply to become American citizens. The process was complicated, especially for former enemy soldiers, but Foster thought there might be special provisions for minors who had been conscripted. "It's not guaranteed," Foster warned him, "and it won't be easy. You'd need sponsors, someone to vouch for you, and provide support while you establish yourself. But it's possible." Sergeant Carter had been surprisingly supportive when Conrad hesitantly raised the subject with him. "You're 14 years old," Carter said. "You didn't choose to be a soldier. You were forced into it by adults who should have protected you instead of exploiting you. If you want a chance to build a different life, I don't think anyone should stand in your way." The thought of staying was both terrifying and appealing. America was completely foreign, a country Conrad knew only through propaganda and the past 6 weeks of captivity, but it was also a place where he had been treated with dignity, where he had been given hot dogs and baseball cards and English lessons. A place where Sergeant Carter looked at him and saw a child who deserved better, not a soldier who deserved punishment. News of the young German prisoner's situation had leaked beyond the camp, and by late June, it had become a subject of heated debate in the surrounding Massachusetts communities. Local newspapers ran competing editorials with headlines that reflected the division of public opinion. The Boston Herald published an editorial titled "No Place for Nazi Youth in America," arguing that, regardless of their age, these boys had fought for Hitler and should be returned to Germany to face whatever consequences awaited them. Meanwhile, the Worcester Telegram ran a counterpoint titled, "Children of War Deserve Second Chances," featuring interviews with local clergy and educators who had visited the camp and met the boys. Reverend Thomas Walsh of St. Mary's Church in nearby Framingham had become an unexpected advocate for the young prisoners. He had been invited to the camp as part of a chaplain rotation and had spent several hours speaking with the boys through a translator. "These are children who were indoctrinated from birth," he told his congregation during a Sunday sermon that was later reprinted in the newspaper. "They were taught to believe lies, given rifles they could barely lift, and sent to die for a cause they didn't understand. Now they're grappling with the horror of learning what their country truly was. To send them back without support, without hope, without the chance to become something better than what they were made to be, that's not justice. That's just cruelty." But not everyone agreed. Margaret Hendricks, a local mother who had lost her son at Normandy, wrote a passionate letter to the editor expressing her outrage. "My boy died fighting these Nazis," she wrote. "He was 19 years old, barely more than a child himself, and he gave his life to stop them. Now we're supposed to welcome his killers with open arms, feed them, educate them, give them opportunities my son will never have? Where is the justice in that?" Her letter sparked dozens of responses, both supporting and opposing her view. The debate spread beyond newspapers into town halls and church basements, splitting communities down the middle. Captain Morrison found himself fielding calls from local officials, church groups, veterans organizations, and concerned citizens. Some offered to sponsor boys who wanted to stay, providing housing and support. Others demanded the immediate repatriation of all German prisoners regardless of age. The situation was complicated by the fact that there was no clear legal framework for handling child soldiers who wished to remain in the United States. One unexpected supporter emerged in the form of Samuel Cohen, a Jewish businessman from Boston whose extended family had perished at Auschwitz. He visited the camp specifically to see the photographs the boys had been shown and to speak with them about their reactions. Afterward, he stunned many by announcing he would sponsor one of the boys who wished to stay, a boy named Jakob, whose entire family had been killed. "If we condemn children for the sins of their fathers," Cohen told reporters, "we perpetuate the very cycle of hatred that led to the Holocaust." July 1st arrived with oppressive summer heat and a tension that hung over the young prisoners section like a storm waiting to break. This was the day they had to declare their intentions. Captain Morrison had set up a processing station in the main tent where each boy would state his decision: immediate repatriation to Germany or request for delayed return with possible immigration consideration. The boys lined up in the morning, some with faces set in determination, others looking lost and afraid. Conrad stood with Reinhold, Manfred, Gerhard, and Theodor one last time as a group. They had been together since that first terrifying day of capture, had shared hot dogs and nightmares and the shattering of everything they believed. Now they were about to be separated by choices that would define the rest of their lives. Gerhard went first. He approached the table where Morrison sat with a translator and official forms. "I wish to return to Germany," he said clearly in English, proud of his pronunciation. "I will help rebuild my country." Morrison nodded, made notes on the form, and stamped it with official seals. Gerhard was given a packet of information about the repatriation process, expected timelines, and what to expect in the occupied zones. He shook Morrison's hand, then Carter's, thanking them in careful English for their kindness. Theodore followed, making the same choice. His grandmother needed him, and duty called him home despite his fears. Victor, Hans, Friedrich, and most of the other boys from their section chose repatriation as well. Each received their packets, their official stamps, their instructions for the journey home. Some were crying as they made their declarations, not from sadness, but from the weight of the decision. Then came those who chose differently. Ernst, the orphan, requested permission to stay, his voice shaking as he explained through the translator that he had nowhere in Germany to return to. Klaus, the son of the SS officer, made the same request, unable to meet Morrison's eyes as he spoke. Jakob, who Samuel Cohen had offered to sponsor, asked to remain with a mixture of hope and terror on his face. And then it was Conrad's turn. He stepped up to the table, Reinhold beside him, holding his hand like the child he still was. Conrad had spent the previous night awake, writing and rewriting letters to his mother in his head, trying to explain a decision he barely understood himself. When he opened his mouth, he found his voice steady. "We request permission to stay in the United States," he said in English. "If possible, we wish to apply for immigration status." Morrison's expression remained neutral as he made notes, but Carter, standing behind Morrison, nodded almost imperceptibly. Manfred was last of their original group. He stood at the table for a long moment silent, his jaw clenched. Then, quietly, "I request to stay. My father has made clear I have no home to return to." Morrison stamped 5 more forms, and just like that, their fates were sealed. The group of 5 who had knelt in the mud expecting execution were now choosing exile over return. 23 years later, in the summer of 1968, 5 men gathered at a restaurant in Boston to commemorate an anniversary none of them would ever forget. Konrad Lehmann, now 37 years old and a professor of German literature at Boston University, had organized the reunion. Beside him sat Reinhold Graf, a social worker who specialized in helping refugee children, and Manfred Lang, who owned a small bookshop in Cambridge, remarkably similar to his father's shop in Hamburg. Theodor Braun had come from Germany, where he worked as a minister in a small Bavarian church. And Gerhard Neumann, now an architect as he had always dreamed, had traveled from Frankfurt specifically for this meeting. They were men now with families and careers and gray hair beginning to show at their temples. But when they looked at each other, they still saw the frightened boys they had been. The conversation flowed easily between English and German as they caught up on lives that had taken such different paths from that fork in the road in July of 1945. Gerhard spoke of returning to a Germany that was both destroyed and determined to rebuild, not just its cities, but its soul. He had spent years working on reconstruction projects, literally helping to build a new country from the ruins of the old. Theodor had found his calling in the church, working to help Germans reconcile with their past and find redemption through acknowledgement and change. His grandmother had lived to see him ordained, and her pride had healed some of the wounds the war had left. For those who had stayed in America, the path had been different, but equally challenging. Conrad's immigration had been sponsored by a retired teacher who saw potential in the boy's quick mind and love of language. He had finished high school, attended college on scholarship, and eventually earned his doctorate. He taught German literature and history, always including extensive sections on the Holocaust and the responsibility of remembrance. Reinhold had been placed with a foster family in Vermont, where he had learned to be a child again before growing into a man dedicated to helping other children traumatized by war and displacement. He had never received word from his birth family and had eventually accepted that they had perished in Berlin. His American family had become his real family, giving him the stability to heal. Manfred's path had been hardest. His father's letter had haunted him for years, and he had only reconnected with his family in the 1950s, long after his father's death. His mother had welcomed him back into her life with tears and apologies for her husband's harsh words. The bookshop he now ran was his tribute to the man his father might have been without the poison of Nazi ideology. They raised their glasses in a toast to absent friends, to Private Foster, who had taught them English through baseball cards and had died in Korea 5 years after the war ended, to Sergeant Carter, who had retired from the Army and visited Conrad every few months until his death the previous year. To Victor and the others who had returned to Germany, scattered now across a divided nation, and to the boys they had been who had been given hot dogs instead of executions and had learned that mercy could change everything,